Michelangelo is one of the most obsessive artists that ever lived. Whether it was painting to the point he literally went half blind or fighting with the Pope over an art project, Michelangelo just saw art differently. And so let's see what we can learn from one of the greatest and most iconic artists of all time. So it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Michelangelo understood the human form better than any other artist. In a lot of his drawings and paintings and sculptures, he showcases a very deep understanding of human proportions and anatomy. And my favorite example of this is in a sculpture of Moses. So the legend goes that upon completing the sculpture, Michelangelo himself was in such awe of his own work that he struck it with his hammer and ordered it to speak because of just how lifelike it is. And obviously overall it's a really massive and incredible sculpture, but one of my personal favorite details is right here. This tiny forearm muscle, which is called the extensor digiti minimi, as you can see, is very visibly flexed. The thing with this muscle though is that it is completely unnoticeable from the surface of your skin unless your pinky finger is raised in a very specific position. That's the only situation in which you can actually see this muscle moving from the surface of your skin. And the fact that Michelangelo had the foresight to add that tiny detail to this massive sculpture displays just how deeply he understood human anatomy. However, Michelangelo did not attain this level of skill just out of nowhere. So in the early 1490s, when Michelangelo was maybe about 17ish, 18 years old, he was staying at a church. And at this point, he was already a pretty impressive artist, but he wanted to take things to the next level. So since this is like the 1400s and churches were pretty powerful back then, Michelangelo was permitted to go into the morgue and dissect human corpses in order to understand anatomy better. Now, even in the 1400s, this was not a very common practice, and Michelangelo himself was not a psychopath, okay? He did not enjoy this process, and understandably so, because cutting up dead bodies is not the most pleasant experience ever. But Michelangelo endured through the grossness of this because he had a very strong desire to create the most lifelike figures in his art. And this is a time period that really ended up paying off a lot for Michelangelo's art. We saw how true that was with the anatomical detail in his Moses sculpture, but it's also seen arguably in a more impressive way in his statue on David.
The details are extraordinary. My own favourite is the jugular vein, which is swollen. This only occurs when people get excited or nervous. Michelangelo understood this over a century before scientists would describe the circulatory system. The veins in the raised left hand are delicate, while the veins in the hanging right hand are pulsing and more well defined. The way our blood circulates, this is exactly what would happen to our own hands in the same position. Every detail points to Michelangelo's passion for human anatomy.
So yes, even if it took battling through the grossness of cutting up dead bodies, Michelangelo always endured any obstacle that lay between him and his desire for artistic growth. In 1497, Michelangelo was commissioned to do a Pietà. A Pietà was a very common religious scene that would depict Mary very sorrowfully holding the dead body of Jesus after he's been crucified. So upon receiving this commission, the 22-year-old Michelangelo very boldly declared that this would be the most beautiful sculpture that Rome had ever seen. And so he got to work, and from a singular block of marble, Michelangelo carved out an absolute masterpiece. It was a work that made Michelangelo very widely famous. People from all over the region flocked over to see this Pietà. Michelangelo had made a claim and successfully backed it up. He was cocky, Michelangelo. He was pretty arrogant, but not in a douchebaggy way, because his cockiness wasn't out of a sense of delusion or anything. It was more so just of the reasonable conclusion that he had arrived at by assessing his own skill level. You know, if Usain Bolt says he's the fastest man of all time, he's not cocky. It's true, you know? And the way I see it, that's what actual confidence is. Awareness of where you're at so that nothing anyone says can kind of put you off. And Michelangelo always had this air of legitimate confidence around him, even before he became this widely, insanely famous artist. But he was open to listening to criticism and feedback. For example, when he was a lot younger, he used to do a lot of studies of old master paintings because he really genuinely admired the artistry in them but he had every intention of eventually surpassing them. He believed in his potential, but he wasn't delusional. And this is a mindset that served him well. For example, in this painting that Michelangelo's master did, Michelangelo himself worked as an assistant and is credited with doing these two figures on the left. And mind you, this was like 13-ish-year-old Michelangelo, so that's pretty impressive if you ask me. So Michelangelo was a student of the game from when he was still really young, but he had something else that really set him apart and makes him remembered almost 500 years after his death, something that led him to create some of the most iconic artwork that we have ever seen. So in 1508, the Pope asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now, Michelangelo really did not want to do this. He was already working on a separate kind of sculpture project, and he didn't want to put that on hold to paint the ceiling of the chapel, because Michelangelo viewed himself as a sculptor, okay? He really didn't like painting. He actually viewed it as an inferior art form. So he really didn't want to do this project, but this is the 16th century Pope telling you what to do, so you kind of have to obey him, you know? So how did Michelangelo go from literally begging the Pope to not make him do this project to turning it into one of the most iconic pieces of art in human history? And I just want to remind you, he's painting on a ceiling that's 66 feet high, which is roughly 7 times the ceiling height of an average home. So they had to build this massive scaffolding structure that he could use, and there's actually a surviving sketch that Michelangelo himself made in one of his letters that showed the really uncomfortable position he had to be in to actually paint on the ceiling. And this was just the first of the dozens of obstacles he faced with this project. For example, there's a point when he'd planned out his entire project and he had began applying the paint to the ceiling walls. But after a few weeks, the paint began to literally mold, so he had to rip everything off and learn certain techniques that he could use to prevent, the painting from molding. So Michelangelo hated this project. He used to write in his letters describing just how much he despised this project, how much of a toll it was taking on his body. But despite all of these problems, he was still reportedly working for upwards of 12 to even 18 hours per day. And that's all while not taking that many breaks and limiting the help he got from assistants, because he hated working with assistants. So why did Michelangelo put himself through all this hell for a project he didn't even want to do in the first place? Well, it's simple. At the end of the day, Michelangelo was an artist, okay? He was an artist with artistic pride. And even though he didn't like painting per se, he wanted everything he worked on to be utterly flawless. And that's why when he got to working on this project, despite not really even wanting to do it, he didn't hold his imagination back, and he planned out a really grand and ambitious piece of work. His desire to see his vision come to life superseded any and all obstacles he faced with this project, which is why after 4 years of working on this thing, when the final result was unveiled, I suppose I don't need to tell you just how much praise it received. Each section of the ceiling depicts various biblical figures and scenes, and all painted in these complex and unique poses. My personal favorite is the sequence that details God's creation of the universe, which culminates in the creation of Adam, which is still one of the most iconic paintings in the world to this day. But this triumph did not come without a price, because Michelangelo's eyesight became so damaged to the point that he could hardly see, he could hardly even read, unless his head was tilted in a very specific position. And this is a condition that came about because of, I guess, the really unnatural position he had to crane his neck in, and the fact that he was maintaining that posture for probably hours and hours and hours a day. It was a condition that was later identified to likely have been transitory nystagmus. Now, this condition was temporary, it only lasted a few months. But I don't know about you, I can never imagine putting myself through this hell. But when it comes to Michelangelo, I suppose that the discomfort that he felt for the 4 years he was working on this project was eclipsed by his desire to see his artistic vision come to fruition. Now, you can imagine that something like literal partial blindness would give people some form of PTSD or something. But in case you haven't noticed so far, Michelangelo was kind of built different, because 2 whole decades after the completion of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo returns to it once again, commissioned by the new Pope this time, to paint on one of the walls of the chapel. And so, just like before, he begged and fought and pleaded to not have to do this project. But just like before, this is the Pope, so you kind of have to obey him eventually. And therefore, just like before, despite not even wanting to do this project, Michelangelo did not hold his creativity and imagination back at all. He went on and planned this grand monumental painting. And just like before, there was all these issues. For example, there's a time he literally fell off of the massive scaffolding structure that they built for him, and he injured his leg so badly. I think he was even bedridden for a few days. And remember, this is a guy who was approaching 60 years old. His body couldn't really endure the hell that it once used to be able to. But just like before, literally none of the hurdles that we've mentioned got in the way of Michelangelo manifesting his grand artistic vision. Because he's just different, bro.